And here, now, a priori, this method could lead to like divergence. It could turn out that information doesn't lead to any particular view. It could be that ignorance doesn't lead to any particular view. But multiple people have used this method on different sets of data and gotten the same kinds of results. So here's what they are for American voters. It turns out that the enlightened public, we statistically simulate what would happen if the American public were higher information, if they were able to get a perfect score on a survey conducted every 2 years called the American National Election Studies. Well, they wouldn't be libertarian, but they would be more free market than they actually are. They'd be more in favor of free trade. They basically start thinking like economists. The average economist in the US is a moderate Democrat. They start thinking like economists think about the economy rather than thinking how Americans think, which is the thing that Adam Smith refuted 243 years ago. They're more in favor of equal rights for gay people. They're more pro-choice, even if they continue to believe that abortion is wrong. They don't want to criminalize it because they think it doesn't work. They in favor tax increases to offset the deficit. They become less pugilistic. They want less war. They're less hawkish, but they want sort of diplomatic intervention. And they're far less punitive when it comes to crime. The political preferences, when you do this with any other country, what you find is the attitudes that high information voters have, or what their enlightened preferences would be, don't tend to track any particular party. Right? So high information UK voters, if you do this sort of method with them, you don't find that they become conservative, or Green, or Labour Party members, or Lib Dem, or anything else. They just have sort of skewed preferences that don't really match any particular party, which is worrisome. Because it's not like, well, one of the parties is getting it right. It's kind of like, no, it looks like all of them are kind of getting it wrong. All right, so I'm just going to jump a little bit ahead. So we know all this stuff about how voters behave. Some people say, no, this just shows us that aggregative democracy, just voting, doesn't improve things. What we need to do is get people in a room with one another to just talk it out. Well, think about it. If we were all kind of like potential Vulcans, if you would deliberate, we're going to learn things from one another. You have information I don't have, I have information you don't have. I'm going to see your point of view, you're going to see mine. We'll kind of come to a compromise position, and we'll learn something. That's how Vulcans would deliberate. But what about real people? How would real people deliberate? Well, maybe not so well. In fact, there's been a lot of empirical studies of how actual people deliberate, and the results are quite depressing. Even these are controlled experiments done by people who want to vindicate the idea of deliberation. Nevertheless, most of these studies fail to find any major benefits, and in fact, what they typically find is that groups polarize. If I bring in people who think A and people who think X or B or something, and have you deliberate, what happens is you become more extreme in your views after deliberation rather than before, which is the exact opposite of what it's supposed to happen. So one way I kind of think about this is in the United States we have a lot of college fraternities, and I don't know if they have much of a reputation over here, but they're not so good. They're kind of drunken, low GPA, sexual assault factories, frankly. So, if you look though at the standards of if you actually look at the founding documents of these fraternities and the ideals that they're supposed to uphold, they're like, if only our members do A, B, C, and D, then that will turn them into wonderful gentlemen who will be highly educated and really good people. And that's sort of maybe true. If people behave the way that the founding documents are supposed to tell them to behave, then these good things will happen. But as a matter of fact, they don't follow these norms and bad things happen. And when you look at a lot of philosophical argument about democracy, they kind of take the same form. They say, democracy would work great if only human beings behaved completely differently from how they ever actually behave. It's like, yeah, maybe, but what does that tell us about actual democracy? So my former colleague, David Esslin, he has a really good book called Democratic Authority, and it's sort of a vindication of why we should have democracy if only people were different. I'm going to end by talking about a couple so what do we do about this? Well, maybe we can't do anything about it. But here we have to sort of ask the question, what kind of value, if any, does democracy have? Why do we value democracy? And I have a few different metaphors for this. One is if you think about a hammer, what makes a hammer valuable? Why do we care about those? People just say, hammers are valuable for instrumental reasons. You have nails to pound in, and you would never insist on, say, using a hammer if you have a better hammer, or using a hammer when you need a wrench. Right? Hammers just have that kind of value. What about the value that, say, a painting has? Why are paintings valuable? There we say things like, paintings are valuable because of who made them. So if I draw a squiggle on a napkin, that's worth nothing. But if Picasso had done the same squiggle, it could be worth $50,000 or $60,000. Or because of what it expresses. What does it express, this piece of art? And finally, if you ask what makes human beings valuable, well, they can be useful, they can be sublime, they can be attractive, they can express things too. But we also think that they're ends in themselves. What about democracy? Does it have the kind of value that a hammer has? Does it have the kind of value that a painting has? Or does it have the kind of value that people have? Well, I think it does have a lot of value as a hammer. So empirically speaking, like it turns out that the more democratic a country is, the sort of better off it is in most cases. Civil rights, as measured by, say, The Economist does a sort of ranking every year, civil rights and how democratic a country is go together. There's a positive correlation between those two things. It's not a mere correlation, it's actually causal. There's mutual reinforcement. Things like how economically free your country is and how democratic you are, those go together in a positive direction. Things like what's the average income of the bottom 10 percentile of your country, those go together with democracy. Democracy is a pretty good hammer. That said, it has some flaws maybe we can improve upon. In the same way that like the BMW 3 Series is a really good car, but maybe we should replace it with something else. It's not an ideal or perfect car. What about other arguments that people will give though? So sometimes people say, well, democracy is a perfectly just system because it's fair. The thing about democracy is that it's fair. Well, I don't know about that. I mean, as my colleague David Essen once said, if all you care about is fairness, we don't have to vote at all. We can just flip a coin. Right? Like, oh, the worry is we have to give equal weight to everybody's preferences. That's fine. We'll assign, everyone gets a unique number. We'll use a random number generator, and then we'll pick someone, and that person becomes queen for the day. You get to rule. That's actually more fair. It's much less biased than actual democracy. You don't have to worry about the influence of money and power and other things that really shouldn't matter. Or alternatively, if you're worried about giving that much power to one person, what you could do is, let's all vote on, say, some issue, and then we'll assign probabilities based upon the voting outcomes. Okay, so 48% of people want one thing, 50% of people want another thing, 2% want a third thing. We'll get those numbers, we'll randomly pick, oh, well, it turns out that this side wins. That would be more fair than actual democracy. So if you care about fairness, you don't want voting, you want something else. Right? Other people will say things like, well, democracy is inherently just because it gives us autonomy and power in a way that other kinds of governments don't. But the problem with any kind of argument like that is that it's betrayed by the fact that your individual vote just doesn't make much of a difference. So for example, I'm an advocate of open borders. I would like to cut down the borders. I want lots more immigration. Why? Because just for a whole bunch of reasons, because it's more just, because I can show economically it's good for the country and so on. Now, I always vote that way, but not a single immigrant has been allowed to stay in the United States for a single second longer because of that. I'm against the drug war. Not a single person has been failed to be prosecuted because of my voting behavior. I'm against all of the wars. I'm even against the American Revolution. That's how anti-war I am, right? Like, we would have gone the way of Canada if I had my way. So, nevertheless, even though I vote that way, not a single bullet has failed to be fired because of the way that I vote. I just don't have much control. So you can kind of illustrate that by comparing it to, say, something else. Like, I'm doing an experiment. I'm going to try to figure out if I have autonomous control over my left arm. I will it to move. Amazing, it's moving. Now I'm going to try to figure out if I have autonomous control over, and unfortunately we're underground, so I can't use the sun, which is my usual example. Like, I'll make the sun set. But do I have autonomous control over the color of your hair? I hereby will that you all have blue hair instantly. Nope, didn't work. So I don't have control over that. Well, voting is kind of like willing the country to have blue hair. Like, what we do matters, but what you do doesn't. Finally, people make one other argument. They'll say, well, democracy is good because it expresses respect for everybody. And I think that's true. As a matter of fact, in a modern democracy, we've loaded up the right to vote with all of this expressive power. We treat it as a sort of badge of honor to say, you're a full and equal member of our society, and you aren't. That's why many countries, like, you won't give it to foreigners unless they've been here a long time. You will take it away from felons. Oh, you committed a felony, you don't get to vote anymore because we don't respect you. People won't distribute it to, say, minority groups and others because they disrespect them, and then when they finally come to respect them, then we'll give it to them. We load up the right to vote with all of this kind of meaning. But we should ask, is it a good idea to do that? Right? Because we don't have to. It's not written into the fabric of the universe that the right to vote has any of this meaning. It's just a kind of fact that we happen to think that way. So here's a thought experiment. Imagine a society like ours where upon age 18, the government issues you a red scarf, which you wear in public. And this red scarf is sort of a public affirmation of your status as a human being. And now suppose a new kind of extremist political party comes to power and they say, henceforth, like, no Polish people get red scarves because we don't like the Polish. Right? Well, if that happened, you would imagine people would march on the streets demanding that the Polish be given their red scarves, right? Or make it any other group, whatever, it doesn't matter. You'd march on the streets demanding that they get their scarves because it would express disrespect. But we, sitting here, recognize it's not written to the fabric of the universe that the red scarf has this meaning. It's just a meaning that we've attached to it. And we can ask whether it's worth revising that meaning if there's a cost to it. So for example, if I were to say to you, we can change the meaning of things. Like if I were to stick out my middle finger to you, that would express disrespect. We could just decide to change that and stick out your middle finger a sign of respect. right? Now imagine if we learn the following. Suppose when I say to someone, go to hell, it turns out that those sounds create weird vibrations through the air, which when they hit another person's body, kill any cancerous cells that they happen to have. If we learn that, if somebody discovered that, that person would win the Nobel Prize in physics and medicine that year, right? If we discovered that saying go to hell in English cures cancer, what would we do in response? We would probably start saying it as like a greeting, like you'd walk around the street going, go to hell, and you're like, you go to hell, thank you very much, right? If we learned that it had that kind, we would change the meaning of that expression. Well, what if it turns out that other forms of like expression have negative consequences? So for example, the Foray tribe of Papua New Guinea, they used to eat the brains of their dead. Now, their reasoning for it was kind of beautiful. It was like, well, when you eat your dead, they always live with you. So like you eat your dead dad, and then he lives with you and through each subsequent generation. Whenever I reflect on that, I'm like, that's really beautiful. I hope my children eat me. It's such a But they discovered, unfortunately, that's really not a good idea to eat the brains of your dead because there's a prion-based disease that's sort of like the human equivalent of mad cow disease. It's 100% fatal that you can incur from eating the brains of your dead. So when they discovered that, they changed their practice. What about the practice of imbuing the right to vote with all the symbolic value? Well, if democracy is the best system, we should go ahead and keep doing that. But if it's a defective system and there are better systems, we should consider maybe revising that meaning. So I'm asking, are there better systems? I'm not sure. I think it's an open question. I think it's something that's worth investigating, but we've been kind of averse to. So I'll list 3 possibilities of differences or deviations from pure one-person, one-vote democracy. So one kind of system, which is advocated by people like Ben Saunders, who's a researcher here in the UK, is what's called autocracy or sortition. The idea is that rather than giving everybody the right to vote, only some people will get it kind of at random. You randomly select, say, 20,000 citizens, and they and only they are allowed to vote, but only if they first go through some kind of competence building exercise. So that's called sortition. Maybe they have to deliberate with one another or something else. Another alternative is something called predictocracy or futurarchy. This is something advocated by an economist in the US named Robin Hanson. There's a nice paper you can download on this called Should We Bet on Values but Vote on Beliefs? Or sorry, vote on values but bet on beliefs. The idea is something like this. Empirically, it turns out that the best predictor of the future is having people bet on it. Having people bet. It works even better than asking people's opinions or even asking experts. Why is that the case? It's because of incentives. If I simply say something and I'm like, I don't like Theresa May, well, like that either elicits your approval or disapproval. If I say she's going to ruin the country, that all that happens when I say that is like either nod your head in agreement or you shake your head at me, or I don't like him anymore, right? That's all that happens. But if somebody then says, oh yeah, want to bet? What do you mean by that? Like it's like Donald Trump will start World War III. You can say, okay, I actually have tried this. No one would take me up on it. Like, okay, what do you mean by World War III? Let's operationalize that claim. Okay, that's what you think is going to happen. All right, I'll bet you $3,000 that won't occur. Right, someone else said, oh, he's going to overturn Roe v. Wade in the U.S. and outlaw abortion. I'm like, okay, I'll bet you $5,000 that won't occur, like in the next 8 years. No one takes me up on the bet. Why? Because suddenly spouting off your mouth has a cost, and you find out they don't really believe it. So it turns out that there are ways of choosing policy. It's kind of complicated, but there are ways of choosing policy where you have people make these sorts of conditional bets. If this party comes to power, this thing will happen. And that is actually better predictive of the future than any other system that we have. It's not perfect, it is flawed, but it's better than anything else, including asking experts about their opinion. Like this beats us too. Finally, there's one other alternative, something called epistocracy, which John Stuart Mill was an epistocrat. So in an epistocracy, you try to split the difference between having a small panel of people vote versus having everybody vote. The worry is, if I only give you power, you'll have a very strong incentive to use it, to think carefully about how you use it, but also a very strong incentive to use the power for your own interests rather than everybody's. If I spread power out widely and you all get power, you have very little incentive to use it wisely, but you might as well be nice. So what if you try to split the difference between that? So in epistocracy, what happens is, in one way or another, votes are weighted according to knowledge. So there's a couple different ways of doing that. What John Stuart Mill advocated was everyone gets one vote, but people with an education get more. Maybe that's not the best proxy, but there are other kinds of systems, like everyone gets one vote, but if you can pass the American National Election Studies quiz in any given year, you get an extra vote. There's actually like another more abstract way of doing it where you don't even have to have quizzes, which could be biased. You can just simply measure people's deviance from the standard vote under certain conditions and statistically determine whether they're more reliable based on that, and it can't be gamed. So there's a way of doing it like that. Another possibility is you do what I call government by simulated oracle. During an election, you ask people their opinion, you get their demographic information, and then you give them a quiz. Just basic information. When you have that, you then statistically simulate what would have happened if the public were fully informed. How would they have voted? And then you do that instead of what the actual unenlightened public wanted. So these are three alternatives. They're all scary because we think democracy is the best system, and maybe we're right for thinking that. But nevertheless, we do know that democracy has some systematic flaws. They're not going to go away. We don't have any good solutions for them. So it's maybe at least worth thinking about alternatives to pure democracy. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Jason. Well, thank you for raising some extremely pertinent issues. I've been struck since the referendum and the American election, how many of my and other people's students have said to me, this democracy idea, it's a terrible idea, it's a terrible idea. So I am aware that in the sort of 15 to 25-year-old bracket in particular, there's quite a lot of skepticism, certainly about the way it's being operated at the moment. Okay, so now, something is not necessarily true just because the majority of people think that it's true, otherwise the Earth would have been flat in 1200 AD. Something is not necessarily morally good just because the majority of people think it's morally good, or else slavery would have been morally good for all those hundreds of years when people thought it was, part of a natural order of things. And democracies with a majority view can make catastrophic mistakes. I give you two examples. In 427 BC, the Mytilene, a city-state on the island of Lesbos, rebelled against Athenian rule. Their rebellion did not succeed, and the Athenians had a debate about what to do with the rebellious Mytileneans, and they decided to put every male Mytilenean to death and to enslave all the women and children, and a trireme was sent off to Lesbos to enact this. There was also a bit of the Athenian navy lurking nearby, so they could call in extra troops. The next day they woke up and thought, actually it was okay for Mytilene, because the next day the Athenians woke up, were not sure about this, had another debate, decided they'd made a horrible mistake and sent off another trireme, double-manned, with extra food so they could row through the night and follow that trireme, and they had to catch up the first trireme. They were given massive amount of money if they caught the first trireme, which they did. So fortunately the people of Mytilene were not treated too badly, quite badly, but not too badly. But anyway, that was a terrible, terrible decision, and fortunately the Athenians realized it in time. Hitler, as you will know, got into power through his manipulation of democratic referenda in Germany, and I think I'm a political scientist, can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that Germany has made referenda illegal ever since. Just saying. Anyway, so democracies can make catastrophic mistakes because majority votes can be catastrophically wrong. However, it is very important to distinguish individual democratic votes from the system of liberal representational democracy as a whole. The system as a whole is not intellectually based on a view that the majority of people want this system of liberal democracy, and therefore it's right because the majority of people want it. We don't even know if the majority of people want liberal democracy. I don't think that's ever been asked. The system of liberal representational democracy is intellectually based on the theories of civic rights developed by Hobbes and Locke in the 17th century. Not that they're hugely democratic particularly, but they do provide us with a lot of the basis for civic rights, and with the theories of human rights which emerged in the 18th century, philosophers such as Thomas Paine and Kant, of course. So liberal representational democracy has a different intellectual basis. It's not majority wish or rule which grounds it, if it has a grounding. It is based in theories of civic and human rights. Not every philosopher, not every person is a fan of human rights, of course. Bentham called them nonsense on stilts. But if you care about them, and I care about them, then I think it's a very powerful grounding. And for me, actually, the most powerful evocation of what I'm getting at here is not a philosopher, it's Colonel Rainborough in Cromwell's army in 1647. The poorest he that is in England hath a life to live as the greatest he. A human being, humanly conscious, humanly capable of feeling pleasure and pain with a life to live. If that's your kind of basic grounding for theories of human and civic rights, then I personally do not think that the right to vote is necessarily just a symbol. For me, it's not the only right, of course, and often you can have a theory of human rights and not include the right to vote in it. So it's something that we can have a really interesting and deep discussion about. But for me, it is not just symbolic. It expresses the fact that each human has an individual right to a voice, and for that voice to be heard, whether they're particularly educated, whether they're particularly smart, whether they're particularly interested. Now, however, so let's separate individual votes and admit that they can be catastrophic from the fact that the system itself is not grounded intellectually on majority rule. But still, we can get some terrible decisions, like the Mytilenean decision, such as getting Hitler into power. Maybe others might spring to mind. You can have some terrible decisions. What to do about this? Do you limit those who vote, those who have reached a certain level of intellectual and educational attainment? Do you allow everybody a vote, but weight those votes in the way that Professor Brennan was exploring at the end of his lecture? Do you weight votes according to what I think your phrase was, objective political knowledge? I personally don't think so, and I will give you 3 reasons. One is a moral reason. I believe that such a system would disregard the notion of equal worth for an equal human being, which lies at the basis of the theories of civic rights and human rights that I've been expressing. Now, I accept that there is room for debate here. You might have a theory of equal human worth, but think it doesn't need a vote to express its rights. I accept that there's room for debate here, but I think there is a strong moral reason based on notions of civic and human rights in which the right to vote is not purely a symbol. 2, an epistemological argument, who gets to decide who is informed enough or bright enough or educated enough? Who is to say what is to count as, quote, objective political knowledge? Who guards the guardians? I mean, after all, even Socrates usually claimed that the only thing that he knew was that he knew nothing. Actually, in his cheerier moment in this symposium, he says the only thing, he knows nothing apart from erotics. So that's the one claim to knowledge he ever makes in a cheerier moment. But it's a serious point. Who gets to decide what counts as objective political knowledge and what counts as a particular level of educational attainment? My goodness me, some of our current cabinet got first-class degrees in PPE at Oxford, and look at them. Anyway. 3, it would be, is a political argument. It would be, I think, it's going to ignore a very profound psychological need to have one's voice heard. Now, I accept that lots of people choose not to vote and don't get involved in the political process, but I suspect that a lot of the people who don't vote might be quite cross if they felt they couldn't vote. The deep need to feel that you have a voice and that somebody will listen if you choose to speak, I think is profound. And I think if that is thwarted, I think it would be really dangerous. And we know historically it is really dangerous. And we know historically that people who feel totally unheard, such as in France in 1789, it can be a recipe for real bloody revolution. So what to do? 2 main suggestions. One, I'm partly in agreement with Professor Brennan, who favours representational elections over direct, insofar as you do favour representational elections at all, but you do favour them over referenda, as representational elections limit the opportunities for catastrophe. 3 reasons for this. The representatives can debate the finer points of legislation over time and take advice and consider evidence, and that evidence can come from people who didn't vote or weren't eligible to vote, or from 16 or 17-year-olds. And my point here is that democracy is not just a one-off shout. It doesn't just express itself in a one-off vote on a particular day. It is an ongoing conversation. And people, even people who are not in the electorate, my daughter's written to her, she's 17 now, but from the age of about 15, she's been writing to her MP. Hasn't had a reply yet, I have to say. She's not voting for him. Now she's going to vote for your party, actually, so you'll be pleased there. Anyway, yeah, be careful who you don't reply to. Who knows where they'll be in the future. Secondly, we're back to why general representational elections are at least slightly less likely to cause catastrophe, not always, of course, than referenda. There are exceptions. Is that at least you've only elected people for 4, 5, or God help us all, 8 years. You know, they will go eventually, whereas referenda, who knows, it could be a vote for all time. And thirdly, in a representational democracy, if you follow Edmund Burke, you could say that it's a representational democracy, it's not a delegation. You can occasionally overturn the wishes of the electorate. I'm not making that point about Brexit. I'm really not. But it's a general point. Though that, of course, gets you into a debate about what we want representation to mean or be. We'll come on to that in a second. My second suggestion, so the first suggestion is be incredibly sparing with referenda. I mean, unless you really sort of feel that the country is lacking the warm glow of social harmony and unity, and you feel they need to get a boost and have a referendum. Apart from that, don't have referenda on the whole. They are not particularly democratic. They're really not particularly democratic because it's a vote which is going to last for very many years, and for the majority of time it lasts, the people whom it will affect will not have had the chance to vote. I mean, they're really not democratic. The second point is, and this is where I do disagree, I mean, I agree with Professor Brennan on some of the concerns about democracy. I'm more optimistic about the potential for education. So, Professor Brennan thinks that education can't fix the problems with democracies because democracies do not create the required incentives for people to want to educate themselves about the matters that would be relevant for that particular vote. However,